QR code if you can. Take attendance, leave a prayer request. Also out on the table is the information for our fast. 21-day fast. Nothing else, we are adaptable. It was originally supposed to be the month of July. And then I remember 4th of July, everybody's going to cook out. Nobody from the get-go, nobody's going to do it. And then I saw in the bulletin we have a potluck on next Sunday. And it's a barbecue potluck. So we moved it to a 21-day fast. 3 days. 3 weeks. The information, what you can eat, what you can't eat, it's a modified fast. It's not a true no eating at all fast. It's a modified fast. Basically a vegan diet. Vegan. No meat product, no. It will make you soar as on wings of eagles, so that you can run and not grow weary. That's in my sermon today, briefly. There's a list of all the vegetables, all the fruits, whole grains, nuts and seeds, oils, other things. In the last page is what you cannot eat. Stay away from those. And it's modified from the Daniel plan. Not a true Daniel plan, it's modified Daniel plan. Okay, time to begin. We would be turning to Mark chapter 15 to continue our study of Mark. We're drawing to a close. We're closing in on the last chapter. And we're looking at something that I found to be very interesting as we are running up on the resurrection story. As I studied Mark chapter 15, preparing for today's class, there were a number of paradoxes. What's the plural of paradoxes? Paradoxes is the only thing I can come up with. Paradise? Paradoxy? I don't know. Paradoxes. We'll go with that. Webster's defines a paradox as a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. That's the definition of paradox. It's something it seems like it can't be true, but it turns out to be true. For instance, someone said some of the biggest failures I ever had were successes. The biggest failures I ever had were successes. That's a paradox. How can that be true? Then you stop and think about it. Okay, I can see that. A failure, by definition, is the opposite of success. But we understand that though technically that statement is self-contradictory, there's a deeper truth. That what may be a failure today may turn out to be something different years from now as you look back on it. It may be a success. A couple of other examples, just so I have you with me on paradox. If I know one thing, it's that I know nothing. That's paradox. If I know one thing, it's that I know nothing. Well, if you know nothing, you can't know one thing. But on the other hand, when you think about it, you think, okay, yeah, I get it, I know what you're talking about. So Jesus gave a paradox in Mark 8. This is not our text, I'm just going back a few chapters. You'll remember it. Mark 8:35. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whoever shall lose his life for my sake in the gospel, the same shall save it. crazy statements, but you think about it, look at it, discover it, it turns out to be true. On the surface, it seems contradictory. Jesus is speaking of saving or losing our lives in the temporary, in the physical, the earth realm. It has the opposite effect in eternity. So paradoxes help you see a deeper truth. You have to go past what's on the surface. You have to get down and see the bottom, the underwater part of the iceberg.
Not always so literal.
Not always so literal, yes. You have to understand what a paradox is. So as I studied Mark chapter 15, I realized this chapter is saturated with paradoxes. And they help us see the crucifixion of Christ from God's perspective. So let's examine some of the many paradoxes of the cross this morning. We'll see what I'm talking about. Number 1, taking notes. Verses 22 and 23. And they brought him to the place Golgotha. It's translated, place of a skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Where's the paradox? Hard to see. You have to go below the surface. Pardon? Well, that's true. The paradox is strength out of weakness. Strength out of weakness. Think about Jesus and how weak he is on the way to Calvary. He goes along what is known as the Via Dolorosa. Right? The pathway that he took. Mark frequently mixes in his narrative what is known as the vivid present tense. That's a Greek tense. Even though our modern versions translate Mark as using past tense words, Mark is not writing in the past tense. He literally is writing as if it is occurring right before our eyes. But our translators, because it's a story from the past, use past tense language. Isn't that crazy? Now, if you have, for example, the old, is it 1901 American Standard, that is considered the most literal of all translations, it is so hard to read, because it is literal, and it doesn't translate well to English. Mark writes the story of it as if it's happening right before your eyes, as if you're seeing a movie, a story, a vision played out right before you. And it's especially effective in the story of the crucifixion. The Greek reads like this, well, throughout, but throughout Mark 15 in particular. Here's what it says. They carried him. They crucified him. They are wagging their heads at him. So, see how it's different? Instead, our translators say, then they brought him, past tense. They brought him to a place. But Mark says, and now they're carrying him to the place. Mark writes as if you're seeing it happen right then. And he is like the broadcaster, if you will. They are now crucifying him, is what Mark writes. They are now wagging their heads at him. Okay, so it's a little bit different. It doesn't make a huge difference. I'm just enlightening you to this, but it's a literary device, and it's used by ancient writers to evoke a sense of the reader being an eyewitness. That's what they wanted. They wanted you to see the event in your imagination. The King James is the only version I know that maintained most of the present tense as Mark wrote it, and of course that original American Standard Version. Now, the words translated brought him in verse 22, that he brought him to the place, means to bear him. Does that change it? They brought him, or they bear him. Does that change it at all?
Well, we thought it was wrong, in the sense that I took someone to a place that I didn't have to carry them.
You're exactly right. We have it in our minds because the movies have it this way, and because the blue flannel teaching set had the little stickers up there on the flannel. Remember those? You're my age or older. They had it this way. Jesus walked the whole way. But that's not what it says. They bore him, they bear him, which would imply what? They carry him. After he falls, we talked about Simon of Cyrene last week. Jesus couldn't walk anymore. He couldn't go any further. The text says, literally, they bear him. They carry him the rest of the way. He has staggered under the weight. Just can't go on any farther. If he could, he would be carried in that coffin. He couldn't. So verse 21 says, they pressed Simon of Cyrene into service to carry his cross. He has endured the agony in Gethsemane, Jesus has. He has been up all night. He has been through many people call it a kangaroo court. I don't believe it was, but he has been through a trial that certainly was not fair and not legal. He has been whipped so that you can't even recognize him. He is so weak at this point, he just can't walk anymore. The text says they bore him or bear him to Golgotha. They carried him. Now, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3 says that Jesus upholds all things by his power. Right? Remember that passage, Hebrews 1 and verse 3? He upholds all things by his power, which is implying he sustains the world itself by his power. Now do you see the paradox? He can't even walk. He can't even carry his own cross anymore. But he sustains the whole world with his power. He who upholds all things by his power had himself to be upheld on the way to the cross, Via Dolorosa. He who carried the sins of the world on his own back, his own shoulders, he himself had to be carried. That's the paradox. In many artists' conceptions of Christ on his way to the cross, Jesus is painted in the pictures as valiantly facing death. All of the mind, the pictures you've seen. Did you ever have one of those old Bibles that had some of these famous pictures in them, stationed out through every few pages or so? Well, he's always valiantly facing death, standing straight up, even a glowing light coming from his head. He had sort of Catholic influence by him. That's not the picture Mark paints.
The word violence means bravery. So you don't take that away.
No, he was brave, absolutely. But he was so weak, he couldn't stand up straight. Mark is painting a picture that was most likely told to him by his mentor, Simon Peter. Mark paints a picture of a Jesus who is weaker than he has ever been, fainter than he has ever been, bleaker than he has ever been. He's going to great lengths to show you Jesus is just at death's door at this point in time. But the weakness on the way to the cross is a willing weakness. It's not that they have won. He has been guiding this whole process the entire time. He's been in control and in charge the whole time. You read in verse 23, then they gave him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. What is wine mingled with myrrh? Painkiller. Basically a narcotic. A narcotic drink. It was for those that suffered the excruciating pain of the crucifixion. It was to speed the process along. Now, the words they gave him, they tried to give him, this version says, they gave him, in this case, is the Greek imperfect tense, which literally would be translated, they kept giving him wine mingled with myrrh. It's a continual sense. They didn't do it one time. They kept on doing it. Over and over, they would offer it. He wouldn't take it. They repeatedly offered it to him, but every time he steadfastly refused. He is weak, but it is a willing weakness. He could have alleviated some of the suffering. He chose not to. He chose to endure it to its worst and bitter end. I have a friend that when he goes to the dentist, he refuses the notebook. Oh boy, that is my worst nightmare. I have asked him repeatedly, why? There it is. I don't know. He never really told me why, except I just don't like that feeling of my mouth being numb. And I looked at him squarely in the eyes and said, that's dumb. Here is Jesus, as weak as he has ever been, and yet at the same time he is showing incredible strength. He is also the strongest he's ever been. Why? Choice. He's choosing to follow God's will. He's choosing to save all of, or offer salvation to all of mankind. He's choosing strength in his weakness. So that's paradox number one. Paradox number two, if you're taking notes. Verses 24 and 25, and I like the way the message puts this. The soldiers brought Jesus to Golgotha, meaning skull hill. They offered him a mild painkiller, wine mixed with myrrh, but he wouldn't take it. They nailed him to the cross. They divided up his clothes and threw dice to see who could get him. They nailed him up at 9 o'clock in the morning. The charge against him, the King of the Jews, was scrawled across the sign. Along with him, they crucified two criminals, one to his right, the other to his left. People passing along the road cheered, shaking their heads and mocked them in. You brag that you can tear down the temple and then rebuild it in 3 days. But show us your stuff. Save yourself. If you're really God's son, come down from that cross. The paradox. There is glory out of shame. Verse 24 has more of these very vivid present tense verbs. In Mark's day, they would have read it like this. And they are crucifying him. And they are parting his garments now, and dividing them up amongst themselves. Now they're casting lots for them to see who would take what. And it is now the third hour, and they have crucified. Or they are now crucified. Roman writers of the day wrote that under Roman law, men were crucified completely naked. The pictures always had it with at least a cloth around his midsection. For modesty's sake, the great haters always show him with cloth. But that's not the way it really was. Very clear in Roman writings that people were crucified completely naked. The most shameful and humiliating thing a person could experience in that day was to be forced to be naked in public. Well, it's pretty shameful these days, isn't it? To some, not to others. I hear there was a speaker at the miners game last week or something like that.
No shame there.
But especially if you were Jewish, it was incredibly shameful. So the soldiers take the only bit of dignity in had left. His clothing. Now think of the shame. Think of the humiliation. Jesus hanging on the cross completely naked. But here's the paradox. Out of that shame and nakedness comes two things. Number one is glory. Glory comes out of that nakedness. In Philippians 2, Paul tells us that Jesus emptied himself to become a man. He lived as a servant, filled with humility. He humbled himself to go to death on a cross voluntarily. That's where he purchases our salvation at huge cost. But that's not the end of the story. Paul goes on to say this. Therefore God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's right after it says he humbled himself and willingly went to the cross. So there was glory in death on the cross. So out of that shame and humiliation comes incredible glory. But secondly, out of that shame and nakedness comes our covering. He died naked on a cross so that we could have spiritual clothing. He would cover us in his blood. He would ask us to be baptized, which is a representation of the death, burial, and resurrection. And in that, what does Galatians say? What happens at baptism? Pardon? Yes, but Galatians says, when you're baptized, you clothe yourselves with Christ.
But on Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, the men who killed Christ probably thought this was the end for him, and this, like they're saying, is shameful.
Yeah.
And Christ knew that he would come back, and that this would be his rectifying moment.
Yes. Every eye would see him. Every knee would bow before him. Well, God clothing us with his righteousness is a beautiful word picture, and it sort of describes the doctrine of imputation. You ever heard of imputation? It's a big fancy word that means he imputes with us salvation. He gives to us salvation. He credits us. We believe, imputes, he credits us with Christ's blood, with Christ's righteousness. The perfection of Jesus is imputed to us. It's credited towards us when we have been clothed with Him.
That's what scriptures say, that we have to be perfect. Perfection that doesn't come with our actions, it comes with what He did.
That's right. It's not our perfection.
But we can't be saved unless we're perfect. But that perfection has been delivered at the cross.
That's right. So what a paradox. Strength out of weakness. Glory out of shame. It's an incredible paradox. Well, let's look at another. Beginning with verse 26. And the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. You have 3 representative groups that are demonstrative of Jesus' worst enemies. And they are unintentionally giving testimony to Jesus in Mark's record of the crucifixion. You have 3 groups of people. They're all mocking him. They're taunting him at the cross. But the taunts are really testimonies. They don't even realize it. Because the things that they are saying are actually gospel sermons. Paradox. They're taunting, mocking, but they're truth. They don't even realize it. So they're actually preaching a sermon. And each one is a paradox in itself. The first testimony comes from, it's hidden in there. Who's the first testimony come from? That's coming. The first one, it's in verse 26. Who put the sign, King of the Jews, on the cross? Pilate. But Roman, yes. Pilate. Pilate had the sign made that said King of the Jews, and he put it in 3 different languages, right? And the inscription of his accusation was written over him, the King of the Jews. Pilate, of course, is being sarcastic. He's just trying to rub it in to the Jewish people that are having him crucified. When Pilate questioned him, the people had said, he claims to be King of the Jews. So Pilate brings him in and questions him, right? Remember? And there's a paradox in his inscription as he writes it out that he posted above Jesus on the cross. When you think about it, what Pilate did was write the first sermon, or the first Christian declaration. He even published it in 3 languages. Because what he writes in Latin, which is the language of justice, the language of the empire, and then he writes it in Hebrew, which is the language of religion, and then he writes it in Koine Greek, which is the language that everybody spoke. It's the common everyday language out on the street. It was a testimony to the world of the truth. Jesus of Nazareth is indeed King of the Jews. He is the ruler of a spiritual kingdom. It's on earth now, but it will be in heaven someday. meant it as mocking, but it's the absolute truth. Paradox. The second group, verses 29 and 30. Those who pass by, it's just a crowd, the mob, the people out on the street. They pass by, deriding him, wagging their heads, saying, "Ha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." It just never ceases to amaze me. Every time I study this hostile mob, who were they just 6 months previous to this? Glorifying him.
They come into Jerusalem.
Yeah, listening to, well, even before that, out there on the mountainside, listening to his sermons, watching him heal people, watching him raise dead people, watching him feed thousands. Some of them probably even ate some of the fish and bread. And now here they are mocking him. They watched him stand up to these hypocrites, the religious leaders of the day, and they loved him for it. But now they think, well, the religious leaders are winning. We better go back to that side. Very fickle. They seized on only one thing he had said in his public ministry. And they saw it as blasphemy. And they didn't even get it right. He never said he would destroy the temple. John 2:19 says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He didn't say, "I will destroy it." He said, "You destroy it." Two verses down, John says, "But he spoke of the temple of the body." He was referring, when he said this in John chapter 2, he was referring to what they would do to his body. He was actually prophesying to them, "You will destroy me, but in 3 days I'll raise it back up." They falsely twisted his words and now accuse him of blasphemy. But here's the thing. They still speak the truth. You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. He will. Come down from the cross. He could have.
And he does.
And he does. They speak truth. The paradox. The third group of people, the third testimony is whom? The priests, the chief priests, the scribes. Mostly the chief priests. Verse 31 says, "In the same way the chief priests also along with the scribes were mocking him and said amongst themselves, 'He saved others. Himself he cannot save.'" Unwittingly, these religious leaders are becoming gospel preachers. To them, their words are filled with contempt, the worst contempt. But to us, they do not. They didn't see the paradox. In his ministry, he performed three kinds of miracles. There were natural miracles, that is, like the natural world, like peace be still, and the wind stopped, and the rain stopped, and the waves stopped, and all of that. Natural miracles. There were healing miracles, where he healed someone or brought someone from the dead. Pardon me, that's the third one. The resurrection miracles was the third group. So in his death, he is apparently exhausted. He's on the cross. He's at the weakest point. He's at total exhaustion. What's he about to do? And if you think about it, the man who calmed storms, those natural miracles, can he not calm his own storm?
At a moment, of course, he's going to create the greatest miracle of all time.
Yes. The man who healed a flow of blood for 12 years, wasn't it 12 years? A long time. Can he not staunch his own blood flow? The one who raised Lazarus from the dead, could he not stop his own death or raise himself up from the dead? Maybe the charge, he cannot save himself, is the cruelest derision of all. Because the Greek word literally is, he is not able to save himself. That's what they were saying. He is not able to save himself. They were witnesses to him saving others. That's why they said that. He saved others. We saw it. But he can't save himself. They didn't know why he was doing it. They didn't know why. They didn't understand. They thought they were winning. Right. He couldn't accomplish what he came to earth to accomplish if he had stopped it. In Matthew 26, Matthew describes the turmoil that Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is anticipating the crucifixion. He is under incredible stress. He is thinking about the suffering that he is about to experience in just a few hours. And he asks the disciples, would you stay here and watch and pray with me? I'm going to commune with God. I'm going to go talk to my Father. And he even said, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to the point of death. So he leaves them, and he goes to pray. And in verse 39, it says he went a little further, and he fell on his face. And what did he pray? Oh, Father, if there's any way, any possible way, let this cup pass from me. Yes. What he said? Not my will, but thine. In his humanity, he is struggling with the awful cup of suffering that he would endure on the cross. If there were a way to avoid the cross and still accomplish God's plan of redemption, he was looking for it, but there was no other way. In his divinity, he is willing to follow through to the very end. He suffers emotionally in this encounter to the point where he begins to sweat drops of blood. A rare condition. Doctors verify that can happen when a person is facing extreme stress. Well, it goes back to the disciples. And he finds them asleep. Can you imagine what they think when they wake up and it's just covered in blood? We don't read their reaction. But he gets on to them. Maybe they didn't have time to react, because he gets on to them. Why does he get on to them? They can't stay awake. He rebukes them because they're lazy and they fall asleep. And he exhorts them to watch and pray one more time. And then Matthew tells us that Jesus returns and he prays again to the Father, but the prayer is different this time. Have you ever noticed that? The second time the prayer is different. This time he's not asking for the possibility of a way out. This time he speaks with resolve. Oh, my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. In his humanity, he struggled. But he made it through to the point of resolve. And he goes back to his disciples and he finds them sleeping again. But he goes back to pray one more time. And he makes the same statement of resolve as he did the second time, as if to confirm it, to settle it firmly in his heart. No change in God's plan. There's no other way. We have to do it this way. And from here on out, you see a Jesus that is at peace. I watched my dad as he was in hospice care. He and I sat and talked. I was amazed at his peace. And I would have been going crazy. But he would just sit there and say, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want Scott, who is my sister's husband, he's a preacher. I want him to open up the funeral. And I want my good buddy from Georgia to lead a few songs. And I want all my grandkids, boys, to stand up and say, roll tide. And then I want one of my granddaughters to, she's very good at writing poems and stuff, and she got up and read it. And he said, I want my niece, Lori, who is my cousin, to stand up and sing Amazing Grace. And then he said, I want you to finish it. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I can do that. And even then, I told Scott beforehand, it's a thumbs up or thumbs down, whether I think I can get up there and do the song. Well, it was a thumbs up. But I was amazed at his peace, and that's the way Jesus is at. He's at peace. He has accepted it. I think there are those, when they accept, death is imminent. Peace is humble. The mocking chief priests and scribes were eerily correct. Himself he could not save, not because he couldn't, because, well, he couldn't. That's a paradox. It's not that he didn't have the power, it's that the plan wouldn't take place. We wouldn't have salvation if he didn't. So he couldn't. So it's not the way they meant it, but they still speak truth. Well, time's just about up. A couple more minutes. What do we take away from today's class? I have two brief applications for you to consider. One, going back to last week, like Simon, will you carry Jesus' cross for him? To those who have never heard. See, there's one last paradox concerning Simon. It's the paradox that God doesn't need us, and yet he does. Jesus holds the world in his own power, but he needed Simon to carry that cross for a few moments. He doesn't need us, but he needs us. Does that make sense? He can feed the multitude, but he chose to use a little boy that had some bread and some fish in the basket. He didn't need that, but he did.
Plan is to be carried out as planned. Then he needs us.
Yes. We have the opportunity to be his hands and his feet and carry the message. And finally, the last application, and I think we're all Christians in here, but just in case, and this happened, I Can't remember where I was preaching, which congregation it was. There was a lady that responded to the invitation after I'd been there for about a year and a half or so. She was in her 90s. She said, I have attended this church since I got married, which was, my goodness, a long time. And she said, you all just assumed I was a Christian. I'm not. But I wanted to be as of today. We had to carry her up the stairs and literally get her down into the water. But what a precious thing. Sometimes you assume. And if there's anything I know from the New Testament, it's that it wasn't really those people 2,000 years ago who put Jesus on the cross. It was you and I. It was our sin. My sin, your sin. And the Bible teaches if we will repent of that sin, if we will confess His name, and if we will be baptized in Christ, He will forgive. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter how badly you have offended Him. Doesn't matter how deep into the depths of depravity you have stooped. There's room for cross. So I encourage you, if you are not a Christian, become a Christian today. Final thoughts?
One thing we don't talk enough about in Christian is, I mean, this part is horrendous, but you wasn't first be crucified,
Right.
and it was happening literally took the sin away. I mean, I tell you, I barely stand up under my arm. I mean, I think he literally, you have to,
Yeah.
really
Took all of our sins on Himself.
horrible.
And for the first time in all eternity, His Father had to turn away. Great thought. Thank you for coming to class. There's a bulletin with a QR code. Grab that. Also, look to see if your name might be on there for our worship leaders. And also out on the page is information about the upcoming fast. If you want a list of what you can eat, what you can't eat, so on and so forth, all that information is on there. That will not start. Originally, it was to be the month of July, but then I remembered 4th of July, everybody's freaking out, nobody's going to fast. Nobody's going to eat just vegetables on the 4th of July.
You said second week,
3 weeks. But next week is a barbecue, potluck. Nobody's going to fast that day either, so we're adaptable. 3 weeks. We're calling this a 21-day fast for every fast. It's a modified fast, modified Daniel plan. So if you go look up Daniel plan, there's still some things different. I modified it a bit. Now, you can do your own if you want. You don't have to do this. I don't want it to be a forced thing. This is just kind of what I'm organizing. If you'd like to do it, love to have you. I've had all females so far. Volunteer, except 2 of them said, my husband's doing it, my family's doing it, they just don't know it yet. Well, that's great. Yeah, but you know, if mom's a cook, you eat what's served. Okay, I hope that you will consider, it is doable. See me for some tips and tricks, because I've done this several times now, and I'm figuring it out as I go.
and no Christian for you?
No Krispy Kreme. And we just got a gift card for Krispy Kreme. So Karina said we gotta go use all of it.
It's a big
Before
one.
this starts.
Must be sabotaged.
Yes.
And we will eat some donuts and sweets before this begins. That's for sure. Thank you for coming to class. We are dismissed.